You're listening to Solera Innovation Labs, where automotive experts from around the world discuss technology trends in mobility and debate tomorrow's rules of the road. Whether you're a technician, a dealer, an appraiser, a car lover, or anything in between, we'll discuss topics that will keep you up to date and help you and your business win.
Well, hello, everyone. It's Don Mykert again in the studio, coming to you again with another episode of our series on the global automotive conversation. Today, we're going to talk about electric vehicles with Matthew Freeman. He's a managing consultant at CAP HPI, which provides automotive data to partners around the world for better insight and accuracy in their business ventures. I want to welcome Matt to the podcast. Matt, welcome.
Thank you very much, Don. Good to talk to you.
Oh, good. I'm glad to have you on the episode today. And as we start to get into this a little bit, why don't we start by giving our listeners a little bit of your background and your expertise in this industry that kind of puts you in the segment that we're going to talk about today. So if you don't mind.
Sure, no problem. So I've been in the automotive industry since 1997, so that's just over 20 years. And it feels a lot like 20 years, to be honest with you, especially now with these huge changes that we're going through. And I started out working for a company that was actually headquartered in Detroit and had facilities in various other parts of the world. And we used to build prototype vehicles for the big manufacturers. So we used to get to see the vehicles before they hit the road. And I was a project manager for them. And then after about 3-4 years, I decided to go into the consulting side of things. And I moved to PricewaterhouseCoopers. And I worked for them for just over 12 years as a consultant. And they had a specialist team that looked at the automotive sector, because they had a lot of automotive clients, and still do, I believe. And we would even produce our own forecasts. So I'd also been forecasting numbers for the automotive industry for quite a long time. And then I came to CAP. And when I joined, it was just CAP, because we hadn't been acquired by Solera at that point. And I had a complete change of view, because I'd been dealing with the very new side of the industry, with the cars before they were coming into the market and immediately in the marketplace. And the first thing that they taught me here was none of that mattered, because it's all about used cars and it's all about the used market. And the used market is the real market for cars. It's where you see the real value and you understand the real desirability of the product. But even then, when I started, cars were petrol cars or diesel cars. And there were maybe a handful of hybrids and a few of these strange cars that you might plug in if you wanted to. But just in the years I've been working here, and I joined in 2012, just in the last 7 years, we've seen a complete revolution. It's been absolutely incredible. So I feel like I've really lived through a major shift, and I'm continuing to do so.
Well, the automotive sector in itself, or the vehicle of itself, is progressed dramatically. You know, when I start to go look at my tenure with inside the automotive space, and really in North America, and you start to go take a look at these cars, it's just amazing, right? The cool thing that you mentioned about coming out of Detroit and working for a company with the prototypes. I remember as a young lad growing up, going to the auto show was about the futuristic looking vehicles, right? Those prototypes. You know, that was the cool part of going, right? That was what made it fun, was looking at those. It wasn't the current cars that were out there. It was the prototype. And really how people can open their minds to take a look at what's going to drive the future, right? So it's interesting that you spent your time there as you evolved into Pricewaterhouse and then coming over to CAP HPI. So let's talk a little bit about it for a minute, because I think for our listeners to understand a little bit more about the organization that you work for. So it started off as HPI, right? Tell us a little bit about that.
So CAP HPI was put together by Solera after their acquisition of CAP. And HPI is our older sister. HPI has been around since 1938. So celebrated a big birthday recently. And HPI's job is to track the ownership of vehicles. So in the late 1930s, you start to get a big car market developing, or a reasonable number of used cars start appearing in the UK. And of course, people buying those used cars wanted to make sure that those cars didn't have outstanding finance on them, things like that. And that's how HPI started. CAP came about a little bit later in the late 1970s. And it was a classic story of someone who thought they could do better. So there have always been businesses that value cars, and CAP HPI was set up as a valuation company by people who thought they could do it better. And we do, because we're the leading valuation business and the leading valuation brand in the UK. And increasingly, of course, we've expanded out into Europe.
And so everyone understands on the valuation side, I'd pause you for a second, Matt. The valuation really gets down to what is the vehicle worth at the current time that they're trying to go sell it, right? So when we talk about evaluation,
yeah,
correct?
So we do two things. Originally, they were set up just to value the vehicle now. And it's a trade value. So we have a big wholesale market in used cars in the UK. We have big auctions. And the idea was so that the dealers would know what they were buying was at the right price. Mm-hmm. And of course, once you've looked at a market and you can kind of see the dynamics and understand what drives those values, you can start forecasting. And so the next step for CAP was to produce a forecast and to look at the relationships between vehicles, because it's all about relationship. People compare things when they buy whatever it is, whether it's a car or a house or whatever. And particularly with a used vehicle, they want to know about the condition, and they want to know about the age and the mileage of the car and all of those things. But there's also all the soft things, the brand, the look, the style, and all of those things. Sure. You can measure those. You can understand what they are and the impact they have. And so that was where CAP started to provide into that forecast space. So we provide both of those values, and that gives us coverage really of the whole life of a car.
Well, and it started out, and correct me if I'm wrong here, we started out kind of with what we'll call the famous black book. And here in the States where I'm from, when you go to the auctions, everyone's going to their black book or their native book and trying to figure out what that vehicle is worth. And so it started out that way. But it's progressed. That in the early 80s, they started to move into what was called the red book, right? Which was more commercial vehicle valuations. Is that true?
That's true. In fact, we have all the books have different color names. So we have black book, which is passenger cars, and we have green book, which is commercial vehicles, and then we have green book, which is motorcycles. And I think we're possibly the only people that value motorcycles. And the idea was to cover the whole of the marketplace. And the commercial market is completely different to passenger cars. So a lot of the dynamics are very different, and so it was necessary to kind of have a different grasp of that product.
Sure. Why don't we do this and pivot a little bit, because what we want to talk about specifically today is trends with electric vehicles. And since you started with the prototypes and those type of things, you guys today do a report on a quarterly basis on market trends. What exactly does the report talk about when we look at electric vehicles today, or just maybe automotive in general?
We find that there's a real hunger to get a grasp of a very, very different market space to what people are used to with petrol and diesel cars. Because a lot of the fact that we see driving that market for the new, but also importantly for us, used electric vehicles, some things are the same. You know, the brand still matters, the shape of the car still matters. But there are so many different factors now to take into consideration. And the most important probably is things around the ability to actually fuel the thing. Because if you buy a diesel or a petrol car, you know where the gas stations are, you know where you can fuel up, and you know that you can fuel it up in 5 minutes. If you buy an electric vehicle, how long does it take to charge? And where can I charge? And do I have to do it at home? Do I have to invest in the equipment in my house? Is there somewhere at work I can charge it? Is there somewhere when I go shopping or I go to the traditional fuel stations today, they have this? And how long does it last? How long is this battery going to last? What's the degradation of the battery? Because this is something that's completely different. I mean, cars age and bits fall off and bits break, but they generally speaking, the mileage of a car tends to say the fuel economy doesn't change that much, but it does with batteries because batteries degrade as they age and their ability to keep the charge level up declines. So there's a whole huge area of confusion and a real hunger for knowledge. So what we wanted to do was pull everything together and on a quarterly basis provide people with that information so that they could see if there was a big investment in a charging infrastructure. A company had come in and decided they were going to put some new charging systems in everywhere. Changes to legislation. The tax system, particularly in the UK, is very much based around the old traditional petrol and diesel vehicles. So the government raises revenue from fuel, from duty on fuel. Right. It raises vehicle revenues from taxes on vehicles and in an annual fee you have to pay. And if you're a business user, you have to pay more tax because the government likes to tax everything. And business users are big users of cars in the UK. It's over half the market. The new market in the UK is business users. But all of these things are different with electric vehicles. And we wanted to make sure that people were able to see quickly and easily what was changing and what was going to influence their decisions, whether they were a business looking at buying these vehicles, whether they were an OEM manufacturing them, whether they were a supplier with contracts into those OEMs. And also, we've gone beyond that. We've had interest around all of the sort of the user area, right through to local authorities, local governments and so forth, who are interested in seeing what the impact will be of having these vehicles on the roads that they, in the UK, they're responsible for managing. So we've had a lot of real interest in it, and it's been really interesting for us also to be able to pull it all together and start connecting all of those dots and saying, okay, these things are going to influence value.
Well, and so when you start to look at it, and I have these basic questions, I think, where the industry is thirsting for, right? So, for example, and maybe you guys have this information as you start to look at your trends, but not every electric vehicle has the same exact charging setup, right? So you need small conversions to use different charging stations because it's not always exactly the same. So there's not a standardization across manufacturers yet today as there is with petrol and diesel, right?
We don't even have the same plug thing that you plug into the wall.
Right.
They vary according to different brands. And even the manufacturers can't even get together and decide on one single fitting. So it's a real minefield for a consumer, particularly a customer used to just go to the gas station and just pump the gas.
Right.
Totally different, complete change of culture.
Which now creates this concept, and I think this is where consumers struggle, right, is I know that I have a battery life of, distance of so many miles or kilometers. And at this point in time, I've used up 50% of my kilometers. So, I can go 50 more kilometers. But, man, I'm not sure if I'm going to run somewhere else or if the car sits for, the whole day while I'm at work. And when I turn it back on because of the battery, does it now say I only have 40 and kilometers left and I need 43 to get home? I think everyone has this concern. I can't just pull off the side of the road to a normal petrol station and fill up, right, in 5 minutes and go on my way. So this is a concern. And so when you start to look at the trends in the used market space for electric vehicles, what are we seeing today? What's that high-level trend? Is the value just dramatically dropped? Does the value stay higher? Is the resale moving, or are they sitting? What do you see as a group?
It's been a real roller coaster because when the vehicles were first electric cars, and in particular in the UK, the two big volume products are the Leaf from Nissan and increasingly Tesla. And the Leaf in particular had a really interesting life cycle because at first no one really knew what to do with them used. So they were losing a huge amount of value. And then the used people got together and thought, hang on a minute, these are desirable to certain kinds of customers. So maybe we should go and look for those customers. And some of them are organizations like companies who want a low-cost form of transport, and are not doing huge distances so that those electric cars and the early ones have quite small ranges for the battery.
Right.
They targeted those. And they also targeted private users. It's a great second car. It's a great car to have, any electric car, if all you're going to do is run to the shops or take children to school or something like that. So it has a real place in that part of the market. So we've seen some really clever remarketing strategies. The big challenge is how you scale that up as more and more of these vehicles come into the market, and how the new vehicles, which have bigger ranges, because that's the great thing with this, is it's almost like it is the beginning of the industry again, when you get technological changes so fast that all of a sudden these vehicles have half again as big a range or twice the range. So what impact does that have on the older vehicles? Is it a case that customers say, okay, I only need 100 kilometers, that'll do, I'll just buy that? Or do they say, no, because the new ones have 200, 300 kilometers, therefore I must have the better range, and these things are completely inferior. And we're now starting to enter that phase because we've got these newer products coming through, currently in the new market, but they will start to flow into the used market. And then you can start measuring the response of the marketplace to those things, because at CAP, that's what we do. We look at the way the real world works. We forecast, but we forecast on the basis of the data that we see. We don't try to make too many assumptions. And sometimes you have to, it's unavoidable. Right. What you like to do is try and root it all in real experience. And we are seeing a marketplace that is starting to come to terms with those changes. And again, there are no immediate solutions. People just say, okay, great, a vehicle with 100 kilometers is always going to be worth this percentage of a vehicle with 300. But the relationships start to develop, and we can start to work with that and start to extrapolate forward into the market. Yeah. We're entering an amazing period with unbelievable number of products coming into the market. Pretty much every brand that sells vehicles in Europe is coming with an electric car. And so the market is filling up very, very quickly with a lot of new product. And all of the things that we can learn from Leaf and we can learn from Tesla experience, some of the other brands that have EVs, we have to now start taking into account all of these new products that are coming forward and how that changes people's views.
Sure. And just so anyone who's listening, and you may hear us refer to EV, we're talking about electric vehicles. So it's just an acronym, if you will. And when you talk about more coming into the marketplace, as you do research, Peugeot's coming out with commercial vehicles. So they have a van that they're looking to launch here coming up soon. Audi going to a whole line of e-tron. So they want to push everything, and they continue to talk about it. And Renault even came out with a electric passenger boat. Right, so we're seeing it with electric motorcycles. What do you guys see in electrified vehicle space or transportation space? Is it going to continue to explode outside of just the automotive? Tesla talks about the truck and coming out with that semi-tractor trailer, right? And so as you guys look in the trends, what are we seeing from that perspective? Commercial and boats and motorcycles, what do you see?
In the commercial space, there's actually a real opportunity there, because most commercial vehicles in the new market, you tend to have a predictable, or a lot of them have a predictable usage pattern. So you could say, an electric van makes a lot of sense, because if it's going to go out and it's going to do some kind of delivery run or repairs or whatever it is, and then it comes back to the depot and it can be charged. And so that's probably a little bit easier to work on than some of the passenger cars and the way that people drive their own vehicles. You never know. Sometimes some people just never know where they're going to go the next day or the next week. One of the issues you have with electric vans is that weight is an issue. The bigger the battery, the bigger the range, but the bigger the battery, the heavier the vehicle becomes, and that actually reduces your range. So you kind of have this slight conundrum of how big do you make the battery without reducing the range of the vehicle. So we know there are some things that some of the manufacturers are trying to work out the best way to do that. Electric motorcycles is a really interesting idea. I say I'm not sure how that fits with the culture of the motorcycle. Of course, people use motorcycles every day as a form of transport. They commute with them. But there's also a lot of motorcycles which are bought as recreational products. So it's a kind of slightly different marketplace, and I'm not sure really how that's going to develop. It'd be interesting to see whether there really is a strong market for electric motorbikes.
Well,
once you get, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, when you look at electric motorbikes, one of the top brands, at least in the U.S., and I don't know if it's abroad, is Harley Davidson, and Harley has dedicated a whole line to the electric motorcycle. So we obviously see something coming up in the trends, and I think. It's going to be interesting, as you had said, and I wanted to step back for a second when we talked about the commercial vehicles, because, the weight, right, the battery weighs more. But also when I do a commercial, let's just say I'm a carpenter and I'm loading up with supplies every day. What's the impact that has on on how far I can go when I've now put 3,000 pounds, if you will, in the back of this van that was designed and its capacity based on it. And I don't know how they do that. Maybe you guys have done the research to say, as they start to go look at, for example, a towing capacity or the load capacity, are they looking at the mileage or the kilometers they can go on a charge when it's fully weighted down? So I think there's a lot of those questions on the commercial side. Right? Wrong?
Well, we've worked quite closely with one of the manufacturers in the UK that is looking at producing an electric van. And one of the things we do in consulting is we take our knowledge out, we take the business's knowledge out into the market and help people make these strategic decisions. And they, even though they are a commercial vehicle manufacturer, they are having to take into account the fact that you have to balance all of these things. That generally speaking, with a passenger car, okay, you put 4 people and a trunk full of luggage in there, it weighs more than just one person in the vehicle. Right. But this is nothing compared, as you rightly say, to somebody whose business requires them to travel around with a huge amount of weight in that vehicle, or maybe even to tow a vehicle. So they have to accept that there are compromises going to be made, and they have to understand that has to be communicated to the customer. So, guys, what do you want to save? Do you want to save money on running costs? Because electric vehicles generally are cheaper to run. They generally are. But is that a trade-off you're prepared to have against the inability to carry quite so much material around, or have a smaller payload, or not be able to tow, or to have a much reduced range. So it's a much more complicated question in the commercial vehicle space. I don't know anyone actually has the answer yet, because there aren't very many of these in the market yet, and it's difficult to see where people are making that compromise.
Right, and maybe another data point for the listeners to kind of think through, because I don't think there's an answer for this next one I'm going to pose to you. But in the commercial space, and because there's not a lot of them out there, I had a transportation logistics company that I was involved in for quite some time, and so we were doing automotive transport. What we found is that over time, the chassis is fine, but the motor of those vehicles over time, you put 1 million miles on them in the U.S., right? And so you find people swapping out the motors, keeping the chassis and the longevity of it. So when you look at electrified vehicles, the EV, it's global. And so that was an increase over 16 by like 57%. So I don't know what those trends have looked like, but when we look at it in the United States, for example, in North America, they're selling roughly 16, 18 million vehicles a year. And globally, I don't know that number. You guys may have that number, but to only have 1.3 million in 18 sold vehicles, and that was essentially more than double from the year prior. Even if we doubled again, we're talking about maybe 2.6 million electric vehicles. Where do you see the trends? According to what I've read, and maybe you guys have more information, is that they're looking at 30 to 35% of all vehicles sold, passenger vehicles, by 2024 to 2025 will start to move in that direction, right? 30 to 35%, and mainly driven by China, Europe, and the United States. Is that the same statistics that you guys are starting to see in your trend lines?
Yeah, I mean, it's important to remember, the UK market is about 2.2 to 2.5 million units passenger cars. So when you remember that, and then you look at, say, 1.3 million electric vehicles sold, okay, that's actually not that much. If UK is one of the bigger markets, but it's not a huge market.
Right.
So the scale is starting to grow, but it is a slower process. There's two things I think to bear in mind. One is that this is a technology transition. So all the OEMs, and this is, there are some newcomers, and Tesla is the best example, but most electric cars are made by existing companies, and they already have a lot of capacity already laid in for petrol and diesel cars. So they're having to transition out of one technology into another. And that is always going to act, if not, it's probably unfair to say it's going to slow things down. That sounds negative. But they have to take account of it, because they've tied up a lot of capital in that existing investment in that infrastructure for manufacturing. The other one is the infrastructure issue, which is how do we manage this new infrastructure for charging vehicles? And that's right at the beginning of our discussion. Where do people want to charge? Where do people need to charge?
Yeah, exactly.
How do we generate power to do that? We're taking out this existing, almost kind of dedicated fuel infrastructure for road transport in the form of petrol and diesel stations, and we're tapping into a wider power network in the form of the electricity grid. But that grid was never built, I don't think, in any one country to take the kind of load that switching all of those vehicles over, even over a reasonable period of time. So we have those two things that are always going to be a consideration. So manufacturers, if you could, flick a switch and they could go straight over, it would be nice and easy, but it's not that easy. There are those things that have to be taken account of.
No, there's a lot of these things that are out there. There was another article I was reading prior to us getting on and doing this podcast, because I wanted to make sure I was properly prepared. And I can't remember where it was that they had some storm damages, and the person had an electric vehicle and could not charge the vehicle. So even though, so you run into these things, so you get these catastrophic events that will happen. And if everyone goes to electrified vehicles, what happens when there is no power? How do we move around? Today, when it's the petrol, the fuel, the diesel, you can go to that station, still pump it, and get in that vehicle and go and escape from some of those situations that are out there. But if I can't charge my vehicle because the power grid is down because of storms, what do we do, and how do we respond? But look, I want to ask a bunch of other questions about emissions and those things, but we're going to take a short break. and then we'll be back after this message.
Solera Innovation Labs is a podcast produced by Solera, a global leader in data-driven solutions and services. Solera collects and translates complex data into actionable insights for automotive, identity, and property partners across 90 countries and counting. Learn more at solera.com or find us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
Well, welcome back, everyone. We have Matt from CAP HPI with us, and we've been talking about electric vehicles. And as we continue through this conversation, we want to pivot a little bit, or I'd like to pivot a little bit, Matt, and start to ask you about some of the legislation trends that you're seeing and what impact this has is emissions. And you mentioned China earlier. I think there's going to be a lot more mandates in these countries where they're having some of these pollution concerns. Is that correct? Is that the trends that you guys are seeing as well?
Yeah, and we're seeing it globally. We see it a lot in Europe. And in Europe, a lot of the legislation is driven at the higher level, at the European Union level. But we see it in India, we see it in China, we see it in Australia and the Americas. Everyone is kind of on the page with this, that emissions and CO2 emissions and air quality, which is increasingly becoming even more important, that these things have to be considered really by everyone. And it's not just the transport sector, private cars and commercial vehicles. It's pretty much every sector, because pretty much every sector is producing emissions of some kind or pollutants of some kind. So sometimes I think the industry feels a little bit victimized, a little bit sort of under the microscope on this. But you talk to people who deal with the airlines, or you talk to people in the construction industry, and they'll tell you they have exactly the same kind of targets. So it's a whole global issue in both senses of the word. And in terms of the legislation, the aim is to get those emissions down as quickly as possible. And it's not a case of they don't care how you do it, but there is an element of you better do it as quickly as you can. So you better come up with some solutions and some ideas.
Right. Well, now, and as I did some research, parts of Europe, the UK, are mandating clean air zones. And so when you see these clean air zones, how does this affect the driver? What are they doing to try and, is it the type of vehicle they buy? Is it the electrified vehicles? What are they doing in their carbon footprint, if you will?
So what happens in the UK is the central government in London has decided that local authorities, so the city governments and district governments, they now have responsibility to make these changes themselves. And that in itself is the first big issue that we have in the UK, because they're all doing different things. So some cities have decided that they will focus on commercial vehicles, on things like deliveries. Others have looked at taxis and private hire. And we have one city government in the UK, in Bristol, in the southwest of England, where they've decided that they'd like to ban all diesel cars completely.
Really?
Which is a pretty radical thing to do.
Yeah.
But how they're going to achieve that, we're not sure, but that's their aim. That's their stated aim. We've had for some time controls over what vehicles can be driven in London, because London always had the worst pollution reputation. And so they have a quite sophisticated system there. And so we have a model that other local authorities can learn from and can copy. But what we think it's probably going to do for drivers is that they're going to say, okay, I'm buying this car, I'm spending tens of thousands of pounds or hundreds of pounds a month on repayments, on finance. Right. I want a car I can drive anywhere. I don't want to buy a car and then drive through a city and find that 2 weeks later, I get a brown envelope through the mail that says I'm being fined £50 for going into the wrong city or the wrong part of the city.
Yeah.
So people tend to be risk averse, particularly where their money is concerned. So we think there's going to be a clear impact on the ordinary driver, even if they're not being targeted specifically at the moment by these clean air zones. Okay. We did some research looking at vehicle sales and the share of diesel and petrol. And it's pretty clear in the UK that since the diesel share in the UK peaked for passenger cars, I think in around 2015, 2016, at just over half the market. It's now dropped to about a quarter of the market. And we think that's been driven by this risk-averse feeling by people. And also there's an awful lot of media stuff around this that's been promoting the idea that diesel, which is lower in CO2 emissions, but also higher in other pollutants, that particularly the older vehicles, they're just not a good idea anymore, and they should be taken off the road. So people are kind of acting maybe a little bit irrationally, but they are acting, and we have to take account of that.
Wow. It's just so many moving parts to it, right? I mean, as we went through this conversation so far today, we talk about there's not a consistent way to charge, right, that's out there. We got battery envy, meaning, where am I at with the how far can I go? We've got it crossing over now into other sectors, the motorcycles, fleet, right, heavy duty. But yet we don't know what the load, right, that they carry is going to have, the impact it has on the battery life. We talk about the resale. And resale was really probably really low at one point. Now they're starting to figure out different ways to market those and the life of it. Then we talk about the legislation side. And you start to look at all these things, and it sounds mountainous, but yet, like you said, it's in its infancy, right? Everyone's going to start to adapt and move over. So there's going to be more legislation around what happens with these vehicles and really just clean air acts, right, all over the place, because we have to be cognizant of what's happening in the global warming. Although where I'm at today, global warming isn't happening as we got snow in my area today. But so these trends are it's amazing. But for our listeners, I think it's important to note that your company, your organization today provides this on a quarterly basis. And they can subscribe to this information, and you guys continue to do all the research that's out there to get everyone up to date as to what's happening in the marketplace, not only with electrified vehicles, but just the trends in general in the automotive sector. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and I say it's a real moving target because this legislation changes very, very quickly. It's a global marketplace and a global industry, but it changes from sector to sector, from country to country and region to region.
Right.
Different parts of the fleet of vehicles are being affected in different ways. I mean, one area that I know we touched on around commercial vehicles, if you look at the really big commercial vehicles, and I know you guys in the States have much bigger trucks than we have here, but we still have pretty big trucks in Europe. Those are probably, I know some people have talked about electrification there. That's maybe not even an area we don't electrify. Maybe we go to the next step in the industry, which is hydrogen. Mm. And then we're into a completely different technology, and we start to think about, hang on, we're now moving beyond electrification into something else. What impact does that have on the electrified vehicles that we're bringing into the marketplace?
It's a great question because when you start to look at it, right, the hydrogen, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Matt, but when you brought up hydrogen, the cool part about hydrogen is we can use the combustion motors that we have today, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you can use either. You can use it as a power source for an electric vehicle, which is how a lot of the ones that there are a few electric cars, hydrogen cars that are available at the moment from Toyota and Honda, or you can adapt internal combustion engines to run on it as well. And the great thing is it's slightly different than pumping petrol or diesel because it has to be kept very, very cold and under immense pressure to keep it liquefied. So it's not a case of you doing it physically on your own. It's pretty dangerous. But it is easier to transport, and the fueling is instantaneous because you're filling a tank, essentially, just as you do with a petrol vehicle. So we have that situation where, for part of the network, the transport network, we may actually need to leapfrog electric and go somewhere else. But then we have to take into account that, will that have some kind of future impact on the way that we fuel vehicles as a whole? Because then we start building up a network, we start building the industry to produce the hydrogen in sufficient volumes, the transportation of it, the distribution of it. And what's interesting is, I used to deal quite a little bit more in my older jobs than now, but we still do deal sometimes with the engineering people. And engineers privately prefer hydrogen, I think. They think it's a more sophisticated and a more holistic solution than electrification. But they know that they can only move so fast as the industry allows them to move. So there are always going to be one or two companies who are looking for the next big thing and the next big opportunity area for them. And some of them already have an eye on hydrogen.
Well, it's interesting because when you talk about the batteries and the hydrogen, we also have to look at the life cycle of the vehicle. And you mentioned it early on when you talk about a vehicle today, be it petrol or diesel. When the life cycle is done, it's recycled. It's crushed. We know how to go recycle the components and the steel and the metals that we have. When we look at the battery side, the electrified vehicles, it's a different quandary to run into. What happens to recycle? What happens to crushing that vehicle because it's a whole different ecosystem and really other regulatory issues that needs to be addressed in that life cycle, right?
Yeah, and one of the interesting things is it may change the way that people own vehicles. So in your marketplace, and ours is very similar, very few people actually buy a car anymore. That you have your vehicle on a lease, and there are various different kinds of leases constructed in various ways, but pretty much no one in the UK buys a car for cash. No one walks in and signs the check. So people are already used to paying for their transport in a monthly fee.
Sure.
So, and at the end of the contract, 3-4 years or whatever it is, they get a new one. They change it over. So there's already this idea that you don't really own the vehicle. So maybe you never own the vehicle. Maybe the manufacturer or a finance house or somebody owns that vehicle. And then after 2 or 3 or 4 leases, they take the vehicle and they extract what value is left in it. And that facilitates this move away from ownership and into usership, which is a completely different area, and we could do a whole podcast on that.
Yeah, we could talk all day on that, yeah.
But this makes a lot of sense if you're wanting to try to capture that value and keep control of that value. And we know that, particularly the younger generation, they don't like owning things. They're used to paying leases on everything, on their phones and other things. They have no real interest in owning things like cars. And so they are a ripe market for that new kind of a usership model. And that might play very easily or very comfortably into the control of the vehicle at the end of its life. And we'll see that. You'll never own a car.
Well, you start to think about it, I say that often because in North America or in the U.S., I believe statistically we're right around 60% of the vehicles sold are through leases. So it's not really sold, right? It's very similar to what you're talking about, and that trend continues to grow. And so I believe that you guys, as you do your analysis and take a look at those trends, it becomes, you're right, it's the usership side, right? How does that change and evolve? And what does that do with the electrification of vehicles? And now as it come back to Tesla in the States has now launched insurance on the vehicle so that it becomes back to that ownership, lease the car here, pay for the insurance, pay for everything right with us. So do you see that as another trend too, where manufacturers, at least in the U.S., we don't see it, but you guys may see it more, right?
We have a lot of experiments in what we call the subscription model, which is essentially a one-off payment. So you have all your usual annual costs, so your lease, your annual tax that you pay for owning a vehicle in the UK, the insurance that you would normally pay either annually or monthly, and the only thing you pay for is the fuel. So that's totally that's the end of your responsibility. That's all you. So you have one payment goes out once a month that covers everything. The only thing you need to do is pay for the fuel when you.
And if it's electric, all I got to do is plug it in, right?
Exactly. So it plays so well into that, and pretty much every manufacturer in Europe certainly is experimenting with these subscription models. And they even come up with great ideas that they know, for instance, that you get groups of people who don't need a car all the time. So, why not just pull together a group of your friends and you can all lease the car together?
Yeah, almost share a ride.
And then you negotiate. Yeah, you negotiate who's going to use it when, but you have you pay your share of the payment and you fill it up when you've used it, and you manage it that way. So, again, totally new model that's coming into play.
Yeah, we see a lot of that out there. And you know what? Matt, I want to thank you for being a part of the podcast today. Number one, because it's been an awesome discussion about electric vehicles and what's going on. As our listeners can hear from us, the passion in the industry and what CAP HPI provides. I think what I'd love to do is invite you back to another conversation and we start talking about some of those type of trends that are out there. I think it would be a great conversation to have and for our listeners to hear. Because again, what you guys do is not just we really kind of went down the electric vehicles today, but I'd like to have you back. I've enjoyed this conversation. Again, being from the States, I know you don't feel that you have an accent, but I love the accent. I could listen to you talk all day long, and I've really enjoyed it. So thank you again for being a guest on our podcast today. I want to thank our listeners for tuning in to Solera Innovation Labs. They can visit us on the web or follow Solera on social media. And if you'd like to be featured on the podcast, please reach out to us. We'd love to hear from everyone, and we'd love to have more listeners jump in and contribute to Solera Innovation Labs. Again, thank you, Matt, for being a participant today and talking to us about the trends, and we look forward to hearing from you in the future. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Don. It's been a pleasure.
Solera Innovation Labs is a podcast produced by Solera, a global leader in data-driven solutions and services. Solera collects and translates complex data into actionable insights for automotive, identity, and property partners across 90 countries and counting. Learn more at solera.com or find us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.